Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're listening and watching today on December the 6th, 2023. Wow, Christmas is right around the corner. Whoa, am I ready? I think I talked about this already this week, not getting stressed. Okay, shh. I'm Dr. Laurie Davis. You're listening to the Dr. Laurie Davis Show. And right now we're streaming live on E360 TV, also on our YouTube channel, Laurie Davis Show Host. You just search that. And also on our Facebook page, Self-Worth, the Missing Link Superstars. So today I decided I wanted to honor a woman whom I met many, many, many years ago. And her name is Isabelle Knockwood. She's a Mi'kmaq woman from the East Coast of Canada. And in 1992, we're talking almost 32 years ago, she was one of the first people to write about the residential school system in Canada. And she wrote this book called Out of the Depths. And for those of us who are not familiar with that whole thing, it's probably the best kept secret in Canadian history that we had a school system in place called the residential school system, targeting Indigenous children to come and stay there and live there and be indoctrinated into Christianity and English colonization, we call it. And Isabelle was actually a resident of the school in Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia. And she was there for almost 10 years as a little girl. So to honor her today, if you want to know more about Isabelle, you just Google Isabelle Out of the Depths and you can see information there about her. And I enjoyed reading the book. I didn't enjoy the content, but the book itself many years ago. And this morning I thought, I should be featuring authors and books and of people who are no longer with us, because unless we just keep bringing them up, we tend to forget about them. So Isabelle came from a very prominent family as well. Her brother, Noel Knockwood, whom I had the pleasure of meeting as well, was the very first Indigenous Speaker of the House in Nova Scotia many years ago. So I thought, to do her honor, I'm not going to be able to read the whole book in one show, but I'm going to read the book to you. And different shows I will feature Isabelle until we actually get through the book. And if that's okay with you, I love to read. I love to read out loud. And sometimes we just need to have somebody read us a story or tell us a story. So I'm just going to start. Chapter 1. When the government established it was called Indian Residential School in Shubenacadie in 1929, the Mi'kmaq population had been steadily decreasing for some time. The official census shows that a Mi'kmaq population of just over 2,000 existed in 1934, and there were thousands and thousands before what I call a genocide. Despite the threat to our survival as a people, we still had a language and a culture of our own. The world of the Mi'kmaq language and culture from which the children were taken when they went to the residential school had its roots in the knowledge of many generations before then. So trying to stomp it out, they did a lot of work to try and do that, but it didn't work. It didn't happen. Isabelle goes on to share, and I have a bit of a tickly throat today. I don't know. Not over my bad cold that I had, perhaps. Here's what she says. I love it. When And I'm talking first person as Isabelle would be talking. When I was a little girl, one of my chores was to help the old people get settled when they came to our house to visit. They were between 70 and 100 years old. The younger ones walked 2 miles through the woods from one end of the reserve to our place across the meadow. My father would be working in his arbor made with leafy branches. He would take a dipper of cold spring water with him and go to meet them. There's a word I haven't heard in a long time, a dipper. It's like a little saucepan, and people used to dip it into their water jugs to get drinking water. So he would take a cold dipper of cold water to meet them. First, they would greet each other with a kiss on both cheeks. Then they would stop and take a nice cold drink, chat a bit, and then follow my father home. Sometimes one of my brothers would go with him to carry the water, and other times he carried it himself. My mother and the rest of the children would watch from our yard. When the old people came, the children were instructed to help them sit down and to serve them a warm drink, usually tea, which was followed by a meal. Then they took out their clay pipes and Daddy passed around tobacco. When they had something important to say, they would tap their canes on the ground or floor, and others would stop, talking and listening. Some elders would not let us touch their pipes or their canes, which they always kept close by. After they had eaten, we gathered up their dishes and they would thank us. The best part came when the old people would place their feeble hands on our heads and give us their blessing. Then came the story time. Wow, we need to get back to doing some of these things. How disrespectful are we now compared to this? Oh my goodness, I don't even want to think about it. The elders would sit in a circle and smoke their pipes. Some of them would be leaning on their canes, listening to the stories. Once in a while, they'd say, "Ah." There was much laughter, merriment, joking, and reminiscing about the past. But when the sun started to set, the mood changed. The elders would be drowsy, and some would be leaning on their canes with their eyes closed. Can't you just picture that? Once in a while, one of them would get up and lie on the ground and take a nap. The council fire would be lit, and a fresh cup of tea, any type of warm drink, was made, and the pipes were refilled. Sometimes they would talk all night and throughout several days. Children were not allowed to interrupt or walk in front of people in between them, especially when they were talking. We were told the underlying meaning is don't walk in front of people who are talking. This custom stems back to the old belief that everyone is actually a spirit, and a conversation between people is a spiritual experience because they are also exchanging their most valuable possession, their word. Wow. I usually sat by my mother's knee and kept very quiet because I did not want to be told to leave. I wanted to hear all of the interesting stories about my ancestors. I was listening and learning, and now I realize many years later that I was actually witnessing the talking stick ceremony. Some of the elders who met at my parents' place for the talking stick ceremony knew the area where we lived, not as Shubenacadie, but as a Mi'kmaq word, which I cannot pronounce, but which means the land of wild potatoes. In their youth, they had traveled long distances in birch bark canoes, the whole family traveling with all of their belongings, taking the family dog along for protection. They paddled to Dartmouth, which is actually where I grew up, by the way of Shubenacadie Canal to the Mi'kmaq Kuspam, the Micmac Lakes, and then down to the salt water. They often crossed over the Bay of Fundy. I know these areas so well, I can picture it. Paddling while on their knees in the bottoms of the canoes, which made them less likely to tip over. There had been a Mi'kmaq settlement at Shubenacadie since ancient times, and the area was considered especially good for salmon fishing, for the abundance of sweetgrass, and for the ash tree used in basket making. I have one of these baskets. I've had it for 25 years. You could put 50 pounds of potatoes in it and the handle wouldn't break. That's how strong these baskets are. So that it must be the ash tree. I didn't know that. The stories we heard the elders tell referred not just to their own experiences, but to those who had lived generations earlier. The elders started their stories saying things like, "This originates in antiquity." That is the English translation for Sakewena, which means this originates in antiquity. This indicated to us listeners that what they were about to say was passed down to them through their great grandparents and grandparents. So some of the legends that I and my brothers and sisters heard were at least 7 generations old. I can hardly, think about that. We remember our moms, our grandmoms, and maybe our great grandma, but that'd be about it to name them. I can name them. But before that, no. Well, the stories were ancient, and the language in which they were told was even older. According to my mother, the Mi'kmaq language evolved from the sounds of the land, the winds, and the waterfalls. As far as we know, there is no other language like it spoken anywhere else in the world. One of the principal ways of teaching young children was through the telling of legends that embodied thousands of years of experience in living off the land. The storytellers emphasized living harmoniously with the two-legged, the four-legged, and the winged ones, and those that swim in the waters, who are now all of our relations. Even the plants are said to have a spirit and are our relations. When we have our sacred ceremonies, like the sweat lodge, we end it by saying, Misitnokamak, pardon my translation, which means all my relations. And actually, I've used that in letters and correspondence instead of saying at the bottom with respect or respectfully. I use that, all my relations, because I have come to understand how everything is connected. Our elders were the most respected members of the Mi'kmaq community. Wow. We need to put that out there because I'm now an elder myself. Our elders were the most respected members of the community. They were the mental storehouse for the genealogy of every member of the tribe. Young people who wanted to marry always consulted them to find out whether they were related or not. The custom of consulting elders was common. Elders also had a vast knowledge of survival skills. They knew the seasonal cycles of the edible and medicinal plants and the migration of animals, birds, and fish. And they knew which hunting and trapping methods worked best with certain weather conditions. Mi'kmaq lore is rich with stories about how the people communicated with all the elements. The young people were educated through these stories. Children who were acting inappropriately, rather than being punished, were told a legend. Some of these were moral tales concerning appropriate action, and others were lessons in survival techniques illustrated by animal behavior. Wow, does this not make you want to get this book? It's still in print. I believe it just went through a fourth printing. It was first published in 1992. Although the early Mi'kmaq were free of such contagious diseases as tuberculosis and syphilis, they were vulnerable to natural ills such as bone fractures, sprains, and even arthritis. So everyone knew some herbal medicine. The older ones taught the younger ones, and many times medicine and food were exactly the same thing. Wouldn't that be wonderful today? People suffering from depression or grief talked to an elder who would take them for a walk in the woods to find a medicine tree, which would be the pine tree. The sufferers were instructed to lean their backs up against the tree and to stay in that position until they felt its strength running up their spines. Well, that sure would beat an antidepressant, wouldn't it? I'm learning so much just reading to you. After the healing, an offering was made to the tree in acknowledgement and appreciation. Recently, I found an old photograph in the Nova Scotia Museum of one such tree, a huge pine tree, which used to stand on the Indian Brook Reserve. I've been to the Indian Brook Reserve many times. When I showed the photograph to my brother, he said, "Yes, that's the tree the people used to gather under." But then the priest came along one day and chopped it down. Ah, traditionally, we were all taught to take responsibility for the protection and nourishment of others. I'm going to read that again. Traditionally, we were all taught to take responsibility for the protection and nourishment of others, especially the very old, who had the wisdom and the knowledge of the past, and the very young who held the future. So that reminds me of a bookend. The young and the old, like bookends holding the books up. Older brothers and sisters were absolutely required to look after their younger siblings. When they went to the residential school, being able to protect their younger brothers and sisters became a source of lifelong pain. Survival among our people was always based on sharing. For example, people chewed food for the elders who had lost their teeth and for infants who had no teeth. Growing children were never denied food and were fed whenever they were hungry, not at mealtime, when they were hungry. Women breastfed their own babies, but when a woman had twins, sometimes she didn't produce enough milk to feed both, so she gave one to another woman to nurse. This did not mean the second mother kept the child as her own, but rather a strong bonding occurred between the child, the natural mother, and what we called a wet nurse. There were no restrictions on visitation rights or the natural mother's right to take back the responsibility of raising her own child. A friend, Lorraine Sack, told me once, when my father was a week old, his mother gave him up. Aunt Jane took him and breastfed him, and he always said that although we were not really related to the Sacks, he wanted us to accept them as our relatives because it was she who saved his life. Isn't this beautiful? Direct eye contact was definitely not allowed between older and younger generations. That's interesting to me because there's lots of controversy about eye contact. We've heard it said if somebody's not looking you straight in the eye, they must be lying to you. But culturally, there are different cultures that do not do that. Partly this was because it can be interpreted in so many ways, including challenging authority, arrogance, hostility, belligerence, and invasion of privacy. But mostly it was because of the sexual connotations associated with eye contact. When people come to your home, you are allowed to look at their faces to see what kind of message they're bringing, whether it is sad or glad, so that you will know how to act. But after that, it's considered rude to stare down or to look directly. At the school, however, when we followed our training and avoided looking directly into the faces of the priests and nuns, we were punished for being rude or insolent. I find this very fascinating because in our culture, in our white culture, people are judged by whether or not they provide eye contact or not. Like, think about that. But here, culturally, it was not appropriate. Our whole family used to go into the bush together to gather basketwood, birch bark, medicine, and berries for the winter. Sometimes we also accompanied Daddy when he went moose hunting. He would walk ahead to read the signs of animal tracks so that the family would not accidentally stumble across the trail of a mother bear with cubs or walk in the path of a moose during the rutting season. He had also had to clear the trail of overhanging branches that could injure the eyes and watch out for hornets' nests. It was he who decided where to camp at night, taking care to be close to a spring water supply. If Daddy was hunting, we'd stay still until he got a deer, which could be just overnight. But during the blueberry picking season, we'd stay until we had our winter supply, which could actually take days. Wow. Some excursions combine different types of work, such as hunting and cutting trees for winter firewood or making baskets and axe handles. Medicine and herbs were gathered any time between spring and fall. And when my brothers were very young, they usually walked behind with my mother. But as they grew older, they would go ahead with my dad and learn the art of how to clear the trail. My mother always was the last one in line and acted as a guard. We always felt safe and protected everywhere we went. And again, it's coming up for me, that bookend, mom, dad, and the kids in between. Some trips would be 15 days at a time. After carefully selecting the campsite, my father made a frame for the lean-to out of logs, which he covered with branches. My mother made the beds out of spruce boughs. You know, they'd be soft and gee, they'd sure smell good. While we kids carried the drinking water from the spring and gathered firewood. At night, we slept in front of the campfire with the night sky overhead. And I believe one of the reasons Isabelle shared this as chapter 1 was to give us a sense and a picture of what life looked like before that European contact. Daddy would sit at one side of the lean-to and tend the fire while Mom sat at the other side with us 5 kids in between. Usually the youngest boy slept near Daddy and one of the girls next to Mom, whoever got there first. My parents would talk late into the night until we fell asleep, and when we woke up in the morning, they were both still there. It seemed to me they were guarding their children all through the night. Wow, wouldn't you feel safe with that? Diotis, my mother, had gathered much of her traditional knowledge from the people who brought her up. She was an orphan who was adopted by a couple living on the Cambridge Reserve. This was in the early part of the 20th century, and in those days, everyone had chores. When Diotis was about 7 years old, her duty was to collect kindling for the elderly couple who lived on the hill. One night she forgot. Uh-oh. And Aunt Sepet put a lantern on one of the branches of the old pine tree so she would have a light to work by. When she had an apron full of dry wood, she took it up to the old people's house. My auntie, who would be sitting in a rocking chair looking out the window and waiting for her firewood. It was already dark inside when Diotis arrived. She made a fire. Uncle Charlie was lying on top of the bed with his coat over his head and with his shoes still on. Diotis asked if he was sleeping, and the Sukquist said that he was sick. You better go and get Auntie and tell her to bring some flag root for the fever. So Diotis ran down the hill and returned with Aunt Sepet and her medicine. Aunt Sepet opened the door and stopped short. She had smelled the fever. She told Diotis to stand by the door while she uncovered Uncle Charlie's face. When she removed the coat, she saw that his face was swollen and had ugly red blotches all over it. She quickly stepped back, covered up his face. "Oh no, it is smallpox," she gasped. "It's going to kill us all." She gently but firmly pushed Diotis out the door and closed it. "I'll come back." Once outside, Aunt Sepet explained to Diotis that there was no cure for smallpox and it had already killed many Mi'kmaq, and everyone was afraid of it because traditional Aboriginal herbs did not work on this white man's disease. "But I will show you how to protect yourself with the winds. Always start by facing in the direction where the sun comes up. Bow to the winds that blow from that direction. Greet the great spirit of the wind by touching your forehead with your index finger and your middle finger to clear your mind. Then touch your lips to make your words true, and then touch your breast to give you a kind heart. Ask the wind to blow away the evil spirits that brought the smallpox and to protect you from getting it. Do that 4 times, each time facing each direction, north, south, east, west, but east first, the eastern door." As it turned out, Uncle Charlie did recover, and the only visible sign that he had smallpox was that his face was covered with large scars about as big around as a dime. My mother passed on some of her traditional knowledge to me, and like other Mi'kmaq mothers, she took care to teach us things which would keep us safe. For example, when she was walking with me in the forest, she told me to listen to my footsteps as I went along. So when I retracted my steps home, this is amazing. I would recognize the different sounds and I would realize if I was going the wrong way before I got too far. Wow, think about that. I'm going to read that again. For example, when she was walking with me in the forest, she told me to listen to my footsteps as I went along. So when I retraced my steps back home, I would recognize different sounds and then would realize I was going the wrong way. When we were taken into the bush as tiny children, we began learning about the environment from the cradle board strapped to our mother's back or from sleeping and waking up in a hammock between 2 trees. As our mother walked along, we saw the changing landscapes. And day after day, from sunrise to sunset, in all kinds of weather, the sky, the trees, the ground, and the waters are what we saw. Upon wakening in the morning, our first sight was usually the branches and the leaves, silhouetted against the ever-changing sky. And the last thing before the dream world took over, we saw the moon and the stars and the Milky Way of the night world. Many parents recognized that their children would need other kinds of knowledge to get along in the white world. My father, John Knockwood, who was also known as John Sabatas, John the Baptist, had never attended school, but he had taught himself to read and write by reading the Halifax Herald from cover to cover every week. He'd buy the paper at the city market every Friday after selling baskets, axe handles, and herbal medicines. He had to keep the herbal medicines under the table because their sale was illegal and he was risking arrest by selling them. When he came across words he didn't understand in the newspaper, he would ask the non-native customers to explain, and so gradually he learned how to read and write English. Wow. Deotis, my mom, was also self-taught, although she used to tell me that she had grade 4 education. When she was 7, she had been sent to a Kentville public school where she was called a squaw, stoned and chased home to the reserve every day. One day, instead of running, she turned to her tormentors and beat them up. She scratched and kicked and bit and gave them the dead man's grip, by which she meant she refused to let go of the handful of hair she had grabbed, and consequently she was expelled. Aunt Sabat told her, "You may stay home now because you went to school for 4 days." So to Deotis, this meant that she was in grade 4. How cute is that? She was very proud that she had taught herself to sign her name and knew enough how to make a grocery list. In any Mi'kmaq family, the worst act a child could commit was to endanger the lives of the younger children. Once, for example, all 5 of us jumped on the bumper of a moving car. Some white people had come to our house to buy baskets, and when they drove away, we went joyriding on the bumper. As a punishment, we were switched. It was believed that the bushes have a spirit and were good medicine. "Now you're going to get your medicine," we were told. The sting was remembered for a long time, and Doug Knockwood remembers one occasion when he received his medicine from a birch switch. I'm seeing the connection now because, yeah, you'll get to swallow the medicine. You'll get that medicine to teach you a lesson. So, a little side note. My mother and grandfather and uncle were very traditional people and had a different way of correcting and teaching me, which was by talking to me and by using switches on the ankles. That switch on the ankle taught me more than getting a belt across the butt, because when my mother had to resort to the switch, I knew that I had done something very serious, like the time I ran away when Mom was home alone. She came 3 miles to find me with a little birch switch. Every couple of 100 feet, she would ask, "Are you going to run away again?" And I'd say no. Then I'd get a little smack across the ankles and I'd be step dancing for a little while. The highest reward was to be praised at a public gathering. That is when an elder stands up before the whole community and tells what you have done to benefit everyone. So it sounds to me like it was rather balanced. Earning an eagle feather is a great honor because it proves that you have received public recognition for something done for the community and not for yourself. The eagle feather, and that's the name of my business, Eagle Feather Enterprises. The eagle feather symbolizes high ideals because it comes from a bird that flies higher than any other bird and comes closest to the source of its life's energy, which is the sun. Those who established the Indian residential school across Canada regarded all we had learned from our parents and grandparents with contempt and hatred. As Bernie Knockwood sees it, they were making a value judgment based on white middle class values. Looking at it from the native perspective, even though you were hungry and dirty, you knew that you were being loved because when there was food, you were the first one to be fed. Although his grandparents reared him in poverty, Bernie still remembers their pride and their dignity. And here's Bernie's note. One of the things I remember is when I used to go picking sweetgrass with my grandmother. She used it in her fancy baskets. I always have a braid in my room which I use for smudging and which reminds me of my grandmother. Whenever I went to my grandparents' house, the first thing that I noticed was the aroma of the sweetgrass. I can remember in Parsboro, and I've been there, my grandmother would take out one side of the street and I would take the other, and we would go door to door trying to sell our baskets. As a young girl, I can remember them coming to my grandmother's house, and she always bought a fresh basket every spring. On good days, if we sold baskets, we'd buy a bus ticket and food, and we'd go visit my grandmother's friend. She lived on the end of this fairly long driveway. Off on the left, there was a small marsh with a freshwater stream, which would flood when the tide came in. And before the bus came in, we'd spend a good part of the afternoon picking sweetgrass. Back on the bus home, people would make rude comments about the stink of the sweetgrass. Oh my gosh, there must have been something wrong with their nostrils. Sweetgrass has a beautiful smell. My grandmother, who was just a tiny woman, would just sit there with her head held high and look at me and say, "Don't listen to them." To this day, I can still hear her. Other times we'd be walking on the road after dark because we never sold a basket. We'd walk all the way and get back around midnight, and Gramp would be waiting for us near the spring with a lantern. Bernie's grandfather made the axe handles to sell in neighboring towns. So from the time he gathered the wood and made the axe handles, it took 3 weeks of hard work. That's working day in and day out and sometimes all night. And those axe handles were just as smooth with no knots. I don't think we can get those today. And just as straight. I remember sitting there and him showing me how to glass them and sand them with sandpaper. I felt proud for what I could do. It wasn't much, but I felt that anything I could do was a help. In the morning, he would hitchhike to Parsboro, and I would sit up on the hill and watch for the Acadian line bus. If it stopped, it meant that Gramps sold his axe handles. But if it didn't stop, I would go down to the spring with the lantern, and I'd see him coming through the dark. I'd run down, take the bundles of the handles, and we would go home, and we'd be talking all the way up. He'd tell me, "It was a rough day today. Nobody wants axe handles. Tomorrow morning, I'll catch the Advocate bus and go to Amherst, and I will not come home until I sell them all." Part of his grandparents' devotion to him was shown in their refusal to teach him the Mi'kmaq language. Now, there's controversial opinions, if you will, regarding the fact that language has not been carried down. And I'm so happy to see the resurgence of our young children learning their language, their Cree language, their Mi'kmaq language. After work, I would take the shavings from their work pile and pile them up against a tree for a pillow, and I would lay there in the sun and listen to them talk. They would always speak in Mi'kmaq, and I couldn't understand what they were saying. So I asked my grandmother, "Why don't you teach me how to speak Mi'kmaq?" And she told me, "You don't need to know how to speak Mi'kmaq. We know how to speak it, and all we did was starve. When you speak Mi'kmaq, you starve. So you must learn to speak English. We don't want you to starve." Isn't that interesting? Like many other Mi'kmaq who went through the residential school system, Bernie is now beginning to reclaim part of the cultural legacy that the school tried to exterminate. Going to that residential school didn't kill what was in us, and now we're trying to get back some semblance of what we were. But there's no way we can go back to do what our grandparents used to do because we don't want to give up what we have now. But what I would like to see is at least a large proportion of our philosophy and our way of doing things restored so that we will be able to incorporate it into our lives as part of our core value for ourselves and our children and our children's children. And that's chapter 1. I'm reading directly from Out of the Depths, written by Isabelle Knockwood many years ago. This book is 32 years old, so I'm excited to be able to share it with you, my viewers, my listeners, and I would love for you to take a few moments and share the show, especially this show, to other people in your community who might benefit from the information that Isabelle shared in chapter 1. Wow. We have to know our history to know today. That's what I'm thinking. And with Christmas coming up, and I did this the other day on the show, I talked about memories, childhood memories, and all we need to be doing is creating memories and telling our stories. And what's happened is the shame attached, not just in the Indigenous culture, but in all of our cultures, really. When we have had a very negative experience, we become ashamed of it and we keep it a secret. And so many of our stories have not been told. And I'm really applauding Isabelle for coming out 32 years ago to share her experience, not only in the residential school system, but thank you, Isabelle, for all the wonderful information. Because her community or the residential school that she attended is in Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia. And my dad was born and raised in Stewiacke, Nova Scotia, which was just like a 10-15 minute drive away. And I can remember driving by that building and thinking it was a hospital. I had no idea what was going on in there, didn't have a clue. And so for many of us outside of the Indigenous community, we really quite ignorant, actually, about the whole system and actually what our ancestors were trying to do with that European contact, colonization, wanting to take over the land, separating our Indigenous children from their culture, their language, their traditions, their way of life. It was a plot. It was like a conspiracy. And it has taken generations to bring that to the forefront so that we can become part of the solution rather than remaining part of the problem with our ignorance and not knowing things. So I'm a big advocate. I'm a big voice for the communities. And I personally have worked on and off reserve. I'd like to talk about that for a little bit for the past 25 years. And my first contact was in 1998 when I went to Elsipogtog, New Brunswick, which is originally English name Big Cove. And we did a substantial amount of work there, and I have so many fond memories from that community. And a big shout out to the Augustine family who take me on as one of their own every time I go there. Jimmy and Noella and Donna and the family. It's just amazing what they've accomplished and what they've done. And so I really am excited to share this with you, and I will continue to do so on the show whenever I have the opportunity to do that. And in the next chapter, the chapter will be called Everyday Life at the School. But it started on August the 2nd, 1978. So that's even before Isabelle wrote the book. There was a little letter that went into what they called the Micmac News. Now, Micmac became the English way of saying Mi'kmaq. And so you might have heard of the Micmac tribes on the East Coast, and there's Micmac Ball, and there's the Micmac Rotary, and the Micmac Lakes, but it's the English way. So they had a little newsletter called the Micmac News. And this was a letter that went in from a lady by the name of Mary Kane. And she said, "Dear Micmac News, I think it's a great suggestion to write about the Resi hellhole. In July of 1935, when I was 9 years old, I was taken there by a priest. I believe he was acting as an Indian agent on Pictou Landing. I spent 7 very frightening years there. The first few months there, all I did was cry. And the more I cried, the more I was spanked and pinched by our holy nun. I had to adjust because there was no way out." And then there's a letter to Isabelle. And this is a personal letter to the author of the book we're talking about from a former student. She's writing a letter to Isabelle. "Dear Isabelle, the big college on the hill is gone now. Over 50 years, that building actually burned. Over 50 years since I spent 7 years there from 1936 to 1943. I used to always look up there, remembering good and bad experiences as I passed through Shubenacadie village. I was between the ages of 6 to 7 years when my dad dropped me off and left me there. I was afraid seeing my dad walk away with tears in his eyes. 6 other brothers and sisters were there as well. My dad was left alone with 7 of us children to take care of. I was happy when Sunday came because Dad used to come and see us and bring us treats. A few of the other children saw their parents too, and other children's parents must have lived too far away. There was always 90 to 80 to 100 girls, and on the other side of the school were about the same number of boys. There were locked doors between us, and we were never mixed or talked to each other. I had been in the hospital before I was taken to Shuby School. I was very small and underweight, and the Sister of Charity had to feed me about 6 times a day. I was too small to even go to school, but I remember being awakened every morning by the clapping of the sisters' hands." Wow. And that's how we're going to begin our next chapter. So I'm going to share the show today with some of my Indigenous friends, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the information that Isabelle shared in her book. And I treasure this book. I inherited the book because it had actually been authored by Isabelle, and she gave it to her friends, Tina and Rhoda, and then it was passed on to me. And it says, "Keep the healing circle strong, Isabelle Knockwood." There are so many things we need to learn. And here's a picture of some of my children that I worked with in Elsie Pogtog in and this has got a glare on it, 1998. And these kids are all now in their 30s. and they have kids. So I'm really glad that we did that work back in the day. Totally. I'm just going to put a banner up because if you Google Isabelle Knockwood, you should be able to get her book, read about her book. I believe it's still for sale, Out of the Depths by Isabelle Knockwood. Little did she know that here 32 years later, I'd be sitting here talking about her. And I didn't know that either. So there you go. We're all connected, all my relations. All my relations. If you want to reach out to me, there's a couple of ways you can do that. And one would be my email, the Laurie Davis Show at gmail.com. And if anybody'd like to come on and, be with me while I'm talking about this or sharing Isabelle's book, I'd be more than proud and happy to have you. Or you can email me at the Laurie Davis Show at gmail.com. I guess I've got that up there already. That's good. I meant to put up my phone number. If you want to text or call me, please do that directly. I answer all my own calls and I answer all my own emails. So I don't have that person in the middle. I just want to talk to people directly. I'm never comfortable with that, so I don't do it anymore. So just contact me directly and I'll reach out and get back to you. So you've been listening to the Laurie Davis Show here, streaming live right now on E360 TV, also streaming live on Self-Worth, the Missing Link Superstars Facebook page, and also on our YouTube channel. So I wanted to bring Isabelle Knockwood and her work forward to you because as we get into stories about what went on, this is a firsthand experienced person sharing what she knew. And here's a picture of her. She went back to university and graduated with her degree in anthropology. Amazing woman. Isabelle Knockwood, born in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, attended the Indian Residential School in Shubenacadie from 1936 to 1947. So she was there 11 years. She is the mother of 6 children and has 14 grandchildren. And at the age of 58, she enrolled at St. Mary's University in Halifax, seeking a major in anthropology and a minor in English. She graduated in 1992. Wow. Cool, hey? And some of you will know the name Phil Fontaine. He was the Grand Chief of the Assembly of the Manitoba Chiefs, and he was also a former residential school student. And he said the residential school experience had serious negative consequences for many of our people who have suffered in silence far too long. It is time to take the first step and let others know they are not alone. No matter how painful, the stories of our people must be told and heard. And through sharing our past, we begin to heal ourselves, our communities, and our people as we look to a better tomorrow. And of course, Phil Fontaine went on to become the leader of First Nations Assembly. I believe I'm right on that. So, yeah, take a break. Go read about somebody else's life, right? It's always inspiring. It's always one of the things that I love is the fact that we can always learn. And as long as we're learning and we're green, we're growing. And if we think we know everything and we've stopped learning, well, you might as well just be dead then. So just today, special day in my world, the anniversary of the death of my niece. She passed away on December the 6th, Erin Margaret Anthony, after a tragic school bus accident in 1984. So the 6th of December is a very memorable and sad day for our family, and extend heartfelt love and hugs to all the members of the family. Her mom, my sister Deb, my mom, Ethel, I was going to say Rudolph, but that was her maiden name. And to my sister Marcia, to my brother Fred, to everyone in our family that was so gravely impacted that day. And blessings to you all. Bye for now. See you next week. Couple of recorded shows Thursday and Friday, and then we'll be back live next week. So talk to you soon. Bye for now.